Awesome, great. Thank you so much, Dan. It's really a pleasure to participate in this really exciting class. So I'm excited to share some of the recent uh, advances in around AI agents, and especially think about how we can use these AI agents to help us to automate and to accelerate different kinds of scientific discoveries. So the broader context of this is that AI has been very successful as a tool across many different domains of science. And traditionally, the way that we use AI is that you first start with like a well-defined scientific problem, right? You have a specific target, right? And then you can use a specific, like well-curated AI tool, right, to tackle that well-defined problem. So an example of this is that let's say if you have a problem of trying to predict structures of proteins, right, then you can use a tool like AlphaFold, try to predict those structures. But you need to have like a well-defined problem first. And we're seeing this kind of interesting conceptual shift over the past year, whereby instead of thinking of AI really as a tool for solving like a narrowly defined problem, people are starting to explore AI as a co-scientist to tackle this broader range of research endeavors, right? All the way from helping us to generate hypotheses to designing experiments, analyzing data, even writing papers. And a lot of that shift, right, is driven by these advances in the AI agents, right, which we have been discussing in this class, which are essentially systems that we can then build on top of large language models that then enables these models to be able to use different tools like AlphaFold and other domain-specific tools, and also to access additional resources like different databases and memories. Right, so this then enables these agents, right, to become really co-scientists that can really help us to across this very versatile kinds of research endeavors. So what I want to do today in this class is to discuss some of the recent advances in these AI scientist agents. And I want to share a few concrete examples, right, of how these kind of AI agents can really help us to greatly accelerate research and discovery. So in the first example I'll share, right, so I'll talk about the virtual lab, which is a work that we published a couple of months ago, where we have a team of different AI agents that collaborate, right, to discover new proteins and new drug candidates. In the second example, I'll talk about paper to agent, which is kind of a recent work, but I'm very excited about this, right? Where we're imagining turning every research paper into its own interactive agent, right, to facilitate knowledge dissemination. And then in the third part, I'll talk about that's actually quite recent conference that we just organized, which just finished a couple of weeks ago. It's called Agents for Science. It's the first conference where both the authors and also the reviewers are AI agents. So I'll share some of the findings that we have from this conference, some of the highlights, and also like some of the learnings. And what I'll do is that I'll pause at a few places in during the presentation so that we can take questions from the audience and then have a more of an interactive discussion. Awesome, great. So I'll start by talking about the virtual lab. So the virtual lab is an open source platform that we built where we have teams of different AI scientist agents that interact and work together, right? So they collaborate to tackle these open-ended research problems. They can also work and collaborate with human scientists. So the virtual lab, in many ways, sort of mirrors my real lab here at Stanford. So in the virtual lab, there's an AI professor agent. And working with the AI professor agent, there are a bunch of different AI student agents with different expertise. Some have expertise, let's say, in computational biology, right, or in machine learning, or in immunology. And these AI agents then have their own group meetings, and they can work together to tackle these research problems. We also built a school for the agents, whereby the agents can actually go to the school and then teach themselves how to become a better researcher. So I'll explain both the virtual lab and also the agent school. So first, I'll just explain a bit of how we interact with the virtual lab agents. Right, so like a human researcher can interact primarily by talking to the PI agent or the professor agent. So for example, I can explain to the PI agent some description of the project that I'm interested in. Maybe one project could be I want to find like a new drug candidate, right, or design a new protein. Another project could be, I want to have this complex data set. I want to analyze this data set, right? Or I want to design like a clinical trial, right? So it could be very different kinds of projects. And then for each project, right, so the PI agent will look at that project and then try to decide by itself, like what are the different areas of expertise that are needed to tackle that task. So maybe for this particular task, the PI agent says, okay, maybe it's useful to have a machine learning agent. And it's also useful to have some expertise in protein engineering, right? So then it's actually the job of the PI agent then to train and to create the sub-agents that have each of those relevant expertise. So for different projects, the PI agent has the flexibility then to create and to train sub-agents with different levels of different types of expertise. So it's quite versatile. I'll come back to and explain in more detail in 2 slides, right, of how that training and creation process of the agent happens. For now, you can think of each agent as basically being like a frontier language model, like a GPT-4 or GPT-5 model under the hood. And then we do additional fine-tuning to teach these models how to use these specialized scientific tools like AlphaFold, and also have access to these more up-to-date scientific knowledge. So so all the agents are automatically created by the PI agent. Then after the agents are created, then they can start to have their own group meetings where all the agents will meet together, right, and then come up with a research plan. They can also have one-on-one meetings where one of the agent might meet with the PI agent to review a subtask. A subtask here could be like analyzing a piece of data set or reviewing a piece of code. So they can alternate between these group meetings and one-on-one meetings. So similar to our human research teams. So I just want to show a concrete example, right, of one of these virtual lab group meetings, just to make it more concrete. So this is actually the first research project that we give to the virtual lab to tackle. So the project is to basically help us to design binders to the recent COVID variants, right? So basically last year, when we started this project, there were actually some of these new SARS-CoV-2 variants, and people didn't have very good binders to those. Right, so we thought this would be a very timely, but also a very open-ended research challenge to see if the virtual lab agents can help us to design these good binders. So in the beginning of this meeting, right, you can see that the PI agent spoke up first, try to explain then to the other agents, right, what is the objective here, right? So the goal here is to design binders, right, to target to the latest variants of COVID. And then the other agents then can speak up one after another to contribute their ideas, right? So in this case, the immunologist agent spoke up second and made a recommendation of designing these binders in the form of nanobodies. Now, this is kind of already a fairly unorthodox recommendation. If you ask most human researchers, right, then they might say let's design antibodies. So you might have heard about antibodies, or these are actually quite commonly used to as sort of binders under many pharma and biotech companies that invest billions of dollars in developing antibodies. Nanobodies are basically small cousins of antibodies, whereas antibodies are found in many animals. Nanobodies are only found in a few animals like camels. Right, so it's kind of a quite surprising recommendation that the agents decided to suggest to design nanobodies rather than more common antibodies. But as we'll see, there turned out to be actually a very good reason for this. So the machine learning agent actually spoke up next, right, and says, okay, I agree with the immunologist to focus on nanobodies rather than antibodies, because these nanobodies are smaller. That actually makes our jobs as agents much easier, so we can computationally model and predict their structures more reliably. Right, so you can see that they actually provide some rationales for designing nanobodies because this plays to the strength of these computational agents. We also have a scientific critic agent that participates in all of these discussions. So you can think of this as kind of like a skeptical reviewer whose job is to try to provide these more, somewhat more conservative feedback to the ideas of these other agents. So in this case, the critic agent says that, well, if you're going to decide to design nanobodies, there's not a lot of public data for nanobodies, right? So then you need to be very careful about overfitting your predictive deep learning models. So the actual meeting for the virtual lab goes on for longer. Here, I'm just showing you the first part of the meeting, but you can already see how different agents can rapidly build ideas of each other, right, and then converge into like a concrete research plan. Now, one thing that I'm very envious of the virtual lab of these AI scientists is that their meetings are much more efficient than my meetings. Right, so one of the virtual lab meetings, they might take a few seconds or a minute, so that in the time that I had one of my meetings, right, so the agents already had hundreds of research discussions. Because they don't get tired, we actually run multiple meetings in parallel, right? So basically, for every scientific question the agents wants to discuss, they'll discuss it 5 times in parallel, right? So in these different parallel meetings, right, there's some randomness behind the underlying language models, so that the different agents can actually come up with different ideas in these parallel meetings. And then we ask the PI agent then to read the transcripts of all these parallel meetings to reach a consensus of what to do next. This is kind of an effective way to explore a broader range of ideas, right, and then still have a concrete to-dos. In case you're curious, I'm here showing this pie chart, basically how often the different participants would speak in the virtual lab discussions. So the human researchers, for example, myself, my students, we don't talk very much. Maybe we speak about 1% of the time. So our job is to mostly provide these high-level guidance to the AI agents. For example, we tell the agents, we want to design binders for SARS-CoV-2. We also tell the agents some of the constraints we have, like how much money we have to do the wet lab experiments. Otherwise, we mostly leave the agents up to the agents on how to come up with their own research plans and implement and execute their research ideas, right? We don't want to micromanage the AI scientists too much. The other agents all have different roles, right? For example, the computational biologist agent does most of the talking here, because here the computational biologist agent has to basically come up with the plan for designing these nanobodies. The role of the machine learning agent here is to basically do all the coding for all these other agents. Right? So for example, like another agent might tell the machine learning agent, right, implement this algorithm, and then the machine learning agent would then implement the algorithm in Python or other languages. Great. So now that we see how the agents can interact, I want to come back to and explain a little bit more of how the agents can self-improve through this virtual lab school. As I mentioned, each of these agents is a large language model, like a frontier model under the hood. So if you take these models like GPT-4 or GPT-5, right, so they're very good at sort of broad general knowledge. But if you go really deep into a specific technical scientific domain, then these models sometimes do not have the most up-to-date information or may not know how to use the latest tools in that particular domain. Right, so filling that gap, that's why we built the school for the agents to then go to the school and then become a better scientist. So how the school works briefly is that we first will tell the agents some of the topics that they should learn about in the school. Like one topic would be like learn to use the latest AlphaFold, right? Or learn about the latest developments in this clinical trials, right? Or learn about the latest developments, right, in these COVID variants. And then for each of those topics, the agent would generate their own learning curriculums. They do this by coming up with a set of questions that are relevant for that topic. Then based on each question, we enable the agents to basically do different web searches to find and to download reference materials. So for example, they can actually go to PubMed and find different scientific papers that are open access, and they can download those papers that are relevant for each of their questions. After the agents have downloaded these articles, then we allow them to read these articles, these reference materials. Right? As they're doing the reading, then we also enable the agents to basically do supervised fine-tuning to update their model parameters. So essentially what happens is that under the hood of each of these language models is a large transformer neural network, right? So as the agent is reading each of these reference materials that they download, right? So then they can do the next token prediction to update the parameters, the weights of these transformers to help it to ingest that additional information. After the agents have done their readings, right, it's not going to be a very good school if there's not going to be some sort of testing mechanisms. So here we also have other teacher agents, who are given these reference materials, right? And then these teacher agents then would generate quizzes to test how well did the students actually learn that topic. Then the student agents will have to pass those quizzes, right? If they don't do very well, then they have to go back to school, do additional trainings, additional fine-tunings before they can graduate. So at the start of the school, each of these agents, might be a similar language model. For example, they might all be GPT-4o as the base model, right? But as they go through the school, as they're doing these additional fine-tunings, then the model starts to diverge, right? Like the computational biologist agent will be reading one set of reference materials, and then it starts to become, going to one direction in the weight space. And let's say the immunologist agent would be reading other reference materials, would be optimized differently, right? So then they start to diverge, becomes more specialized agents. And we've done experiments to show that actually having these more specialized agents that collaborate ends up being very beneficial, right? Compared to if we try to fine-tune or teach like a single agent all of these different areas by itself. I'll come back to this in a little bit. So now that we see how the agents can interact and also how they can self-improve through this agent school, right? I'll also just mention that the agent school is also relatively efficient, right? So usually within a day or so, then agents have gone through the school and then taught themselves how to become a better researcher. And we designed this school to be quite scalable, right? Because here it's actually mostly autonomous, or the only part where the human input is needed is to specify what are the critical topics that the agents should learn about. Otherwise, it's all sort of self-improvement mechanisms. And we designed this to be mostly autonomous then that enables the agents then to be able to learn about new topics beyond what I could teach the agents. Right? For example, I don't know that very much about how to design nanobodies, but the agents are not limited by what I know, right? So they can actually teach themselves how to become a better expert in nanobody designs. Okay, so now I want to come back to this running example, right? Just to illustrate the kinds of scientific research that agents can do. Right. So recall that the first project we give to these virtual labs to help us to design binders to the recent COVID variants. And agents decided to design these binders in the form of nanobodies, these are which are small proteins. Now, to help them to design these nanobodies, the agents decided to create a new computational pipeline to basically simulate and then to optimize these nanobodies in silico. So here's the pipelines created by the agents. I think it's actually quite interesting. So first, the agents will actually use ESM, which is a protein language model. So what ESM does is that it will take some amino acid sequence as input and just computes a score to say how likely is this to form like a stable protein. So the agents will then take those stable candidates, right, and pass that into AlphaFold together with the spike protein of the target COVID variant. So AlphaFold generates this three-dimensional structure, right, of how this nanobody candidate could bind to the target. So the agent then will look at that three-dimensional structure to extract some geometric information. And then the agents will pass that three-dimensional structure from AlphaFold into Rosetta, which is like a physics model simulator, right, to do physics-style molecular dynamics to relax that structure, right, and then estimate the binding affinity. The agent then will also extract that information from Rosetta. So what I think is quite interesting is that each of these different tools have been used, right, in previous publications, but this computational pipelines created by the agents is actually different from what people have done before. So first is that the agents actually have modified these tools. For example, it actually modified the scoring function for ESM, which made it more suitable for this particular project. So it's different from how people have used ESM before. And also that's the way that it's combined together into this combination, right, of tools. It's also, we haven't seen that in any previous publications, right? So there's some combinatorial creativity exhibited here by the AI scientist agents. And this computational pipeline is actually really useful, right? Because the initial design space for nanobodies is just exponentially large, right? So there could be billions and billions of potential nanobodies. And by running this computational tool, the agents are able to rapidly reduce that design space, right, into a small set of 92 candidates. And the agent told us, okay, so here are these 92 nanobody candidates that are the most promising binders, and you just have to test these 92 candidates. And here, the agents do not do their own wet lab experiments yet, right? So this is where also human AI collaboration is really critical, right? So they give us these candidates, and then we, with our experimental collaborators, then we can actually make these in the real world and test them in the wet lab. So we actually made each of these 92 nanobodies designed by the AI agents. So here I'm showing you two of these nanobody designs. So these are small proteins. And we made them we synthesized them, right? And we test them in the wet lab to see how well do they bind to the different COVID variants. So I'll just explain what these curves mean one by one, right? So this bottom red curve was the open circles. This is where if we take previous human designed nanobodies and test that against this recent COVID variant called JN1 variant, which started to spread last year, you can see that this human design antibody does not bind to this JN1 variant. The second red curve was the solid circles. This is the virtual lab design, the new nanobody. Right, so people haven't seen this before. And this new nanobody actually binds much better, right, to this new recent COVID variant. The two blue curves are basically if we test these nanobodies against a very different strain of COVID, right? So this top blue one is the nanobody designed by the virtual lab. It also shows stronger binding to this different COVID variant compared to the human designed nanobodies. What's now shown here is that we also did additional experiments. We tested these proteins against other viruses and also against humans' own proteins, right? And these nanobodies do not bind to these other proteins. And that's actually very useful and very important because that means that these nanobodies candidates are less likely to have these side effects, right? Toxicity and other side effects. I think there's definitely need for additional experiments, right? Room for additional experiments. And but what's quite nice here is that just from this, with the help of the virtual lab, right? So within a few days, right? So the agents are able to design this computational pipeline, implement it, and then design this protein for us that we can then experimentally validate, right? That really significantly reduced the time for tackling this very challenging research problem. Great. So just to summarize this part here, right? The first part, right? So here we released as a part of our recent paper, right? This open source pipeline for the virtual lab, right? So people can actually use this now to tackle quite different kinds of scientific problems. Right? So now there are also other colleagues who are using this virtual lab to look for like Alzheimer biomarkers, right? And new materials, physics, right? A lot of applications. So it's actually quite versatile, right? So it's not limited to designing proteins because for different projects, the PI agent can actually automatically create different sub-agents with the relevant expertise. In our paper, we show a lot more details and experiments to show that when we have teams with multiple agents with different expertise that collaborate, that often leads to much better results and more creative science than having a single agent to solve the problem by itself. Basically, what often happens is that when you have these teams of multiple agents, they get into debates and disagreements, right? And they have to resolve those debates. And through those iterative discussions, the agents actually often achieve more creative and more robust reasoning than if we have like a single agent try to tackle the problem all by itself from start. We also found it quite useful to provide these agents, these scientist agents, with additional resources. Right? For example, each of the agent has like a memory mechanism, sort of like a digital notebook, so they can remember their notes, right, from previous group meetings and one-on-one meetings. They remember the transcripts from all these previous discussions. All the agents also have a virtual sandbox, right? So they can actually locally modify and then develop different tools. Right? For example, they can locally access tools like AlphaFold and modify other tools. That makes the agents both safer, but also more effective. Finally, I think something that's really interesting is that the agents also have their own social dynamics. So by that, I mean, like, when humans collaborate, right? So some people might talk more than others, right? They have louder voices. All of that changes the trajectory of the research collaboration. So similarly, when the agents collaborate, right, they also have their own social dynamics. So it depends on which agent speaks first, or depends on which agent speaks more, and that it also changes which ideas gets implemented, right, and which ideas the final outcomes. But something that we can do with the AI agents in the virtual lab that we cannot do with the human teams is that we can do all sorts of interesting oblations because we can run all these meetings, discussions in parallel. In each of these parallel meetings, we can actually specify maybe in this meeting, right, the first agent one speaks first, right? In this other meeting, agent two speaks first, right? And we can actually also assign different personalities to different agents in different parallel meetings, and then see what configuration of agents actually leads to the most creative and most effective research. So I view this as almost as a fascinating petri dish where we can do experiments, like science of science experiments, on top of these different teams of agents to see what combination of agents is the most effective at doing science. And then we can take those insights that we learn from these agent experiments, maybe help us to inform how to better design our human research teams.
About the same idea, and then that idea gets represented more and selected by the final agent. Wouldn't it bias the result, and how to avoid it using more models?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. Yeah, so since we run these different parallel meetings, it does happen that multiple of the parallel meetings actually converge onto the same research idea. Right? We actually view that as maybe a feature rather than a bug, right? Because the consensus that the research ideas often show up across multiple meetings often tends to be maybe more reliable and less prone to hallucinations. Great. Other questions?
And the other one is, how do you control for compounding topic, drift and or content window utilization among agents in multi-agents ecosystem?
Yeah, thanks for that. So here, because the virtual lab agents have to tackle this quite open-ended, long horizon research task, right? And because it's open-ended, so they don't know how many, how much time or how many rounds of discussions they need. So here, We found a few mechanisms to be quite useful, right? So first is that we do have an external memory mechanism, right? So that the agents can actually be able to store all of their previous discussions. And we also have the PI agent to help to basically organize these memories for the other agents, right? So for example, the PI agent would periodically say that, okay, so here's everything that we've done so far, right? And here's the status of the project, and here's sort of the next to-dos. That sort of uh, provide like a regular sync, right, for all of these other agents. In addition, we also found it to be quite useful to have this critic agent as a way to try to reduce these compounding errors, right? So the job of the critic agent is to participate in all of these discussions, in both the team discussions and also one-on-one meetings, right? And then the critic agent often helps to like reduce these errors from accumulating. But this is also where it's important to mention that this is the virtual lab is also designed to be like a human AI collaboration, right? So it's not just the agents at any time that we want, right? So often what we do is that we actually have the PI agents sort of summarize their meetings, and then we can look over their meeting summaries. And sometimes if we think it's okay, then we don't need to provide the feedback. But if we think the agents are maybe going in different direction, then we can tell them, okay, have you thought about this topic, right? Or have you considered this other option, right? So we can then provide the feedback to the agents. So that this, by having this human in the loop process, right, that also helps to reduce these compounding errors or topic drift. So in the second part, the second example I want to give is this quite recent work that we call paper to agent. It's our effort to, in some ways, to reimagine what knowledge looks like. Right. So for the past several hundred years, right, the way that people represent knowledge, right, is really in the form of papers. Right. So you have scientists that would maybe spend years, right, doing difficult experiments, right, and then they would write a paper to try to capture all of the insights and knowledge that's learned through their research. But if you think about it, right, each paper is actually a very passive artifact of knowledge. Right. It often it's quite difficult for the readers of that paper just by reading that PDF to figure out like, what are really the real insights and knowledge from that many years of work. Moreover, a lot of the papers now actually releases some code or these some data. It's often quite challenging for the users to figure out how to adapt or how to use that code for their own research problems, right? Especially if those readers are less technically inclined. So we thought, okay, so in rather than having these passive artifacts of papers, right? So what if we turn each paper into an interactive agent, right? So that agent then becomes sort of like the virtual corresponding author that knows all the details of the paper and also knows how to use the code and data associated with that paper. And then that paper agent then it will be responsible for helping any readers and any users to apply the methods from the paper, right, to their own problems, to new projects. All right, so in this case, rather than having to read this big PDF myself and try to figure out what's going on and then download the code and tweak it, which would be a lot of work, I can just directly talk to this paper agent, right? I can ask the paper agent, okay, is this, can you help me apply the tools from this paper to my new problem? And then the paper agent then would automatically apply the tools to generate a reproducible workflow and then provides like a final summary of the end results. Right. So in this case, that's I didn't have I can directly interact with the paper agent without having to download and try to set up like the repo from the paper myself. Okay, so the way that we do this is that we convert each paper, a paper into an agent through this automated workflow that we created that we call paper to agent. So briefly, here's how the workflow looks like. Right? So we start with the paper and any code base associated with that paper. And then we have a bunch of different worker agents. So they have one worker agent whose job is to actually set up like a virtual environment to basically simulate the environment from that original paper, a code base, and then also extract out any of the tools, right, that are important in that code base. And then the third agent worker is to basically test that virtual environment to make sure that it's able to reproduce the results right from the original paper. So all of that ends up being converted into a model context protocol for the paper or MCP. So these MCPs have recently emerged as sort of the industry standard for communicating resources to large language models. Right, so here, essentially, we convert each paper into a paper MCP. The paper MCP then encapsulates all the tools, the insights, and then the workflows associated with that paper. And then we can automatically serve this paper MCP on a remote server. And then by connecting this MCP, right, with a downstream chatbot, this enables that chatbot to become a knowledgeable paper agent, right, that knows about how to use the tools and methods and data from the original paper. So I want to give some concrete examples of what this looks like. All right, so here's one example where we can take, so ScanPy is a very commonly used tool for like computational biology analysis. Right, so with paper agent, then we automatically convert ScanPy into a ScanPy agent. Right, so now the user, right, can maybe a biologist can just say, okay, can you help me analyze my single cell data set? Right, I can give that request to ScanPy agent. And ScanPy agent then will be able to correctly then use all the tools from ScanPy and then generate a nice analysis and be able to do this work for the users. Right, so the way that we validate the ScanPy agent is that then we give it some complex data sets and tasks, and then we have the agent generate these analysis, right? So it's able to generate all these different figures automatically. And in parallel, right, human experts also analyzing the same data set will also generate these figures, right? And we can compare all of these results, right, all the intermediate figures and final conclusions. And in this case, the results from the ScanPy agent matches exactly the results from the human expert when they're analyzing the same data set. Another good use case of this paper to agent is to help us to make new advances, right, in AI more accessible. Right. So an example of this is that so Google DeepMind recently released this very powerful model called AlphaGenome, right? So it's basically a deep learning model that can help to interpret the effects of different mutations in the genome. So with paper to agent, then we automatically convert AlphaGenome into an AlphaGenome agent. Right, so now the users, right, can just ask this AlphaGenome agent, right, any questions about the paper, but it can also ask the agent to apply the methods, right, AlphaGenome method to tackle new problems. So here the user is asking the AlphaGenome agent, right, to help to basically look for some causal genes that are associated with LDL cholesterol. And the agent then would think through, generate a research plan, and then would actually use the AlphaGenome tools, right, to then generate all these intermediate analysis, and finally returns back to the scientist some candidate genes, right? In this case, actually identified this SORT1 gene as potentially like a likely candidate to be associated with LDL cholesterol. So we've done systematic benchmarkings to evaluate the performance of this paper to agent, right? So we generated quite complex real-world scientific tasks, right? And then the paper to agent is able to solve all of these tasks correctly. So a natural baseline would be, let's say, if you give Claude Code, right? If you just give the paper to Claude Code and also give Claude Code access to the paper's repository, the GitHub page, and ask Claude Code to directly run the repo, right, to tackle the same tasks, then it ends up making a lot more mistakes. And other wrapper methods also end up being much more fragile. So on the right here, we basically show the runtime, right? Here, a paper agent only requires less than 1/3 of the runtime of using Claude Code directly, which also benefits, it highlights the benefit, right, of our approach of first generating this robust paper MCP, right, and then using from this paper MCP, then doing the additional analysis. So something that I find really exciting is that this paper agent can enable a new form of collaboration, like agent-to-agent collaboration. Right. So imagine now you have these thousands of papers that get published, right? So each paper now becomes turned into its own paper agent. So let's say if somebody here at Berkeley develops a new method, right? So that's then automatically turned into a new method agent. Somebody at Stanford, and maybe let's say publishes a new data set, right? And then that paper also becomes like a new data agent with our approach, right? So those two agents then can directly collaborate and then say, okay, is your method applicable to my data? If it is, then they can collaborate and start to generate new insights without human intervention. Right? In the past, right? So this would have required like the human authors to write emails back and forth to each other, maybe set up a meeting, and oftentimes they don't really have bandwidth to collaborate, right? So then nothing really happens. But here, the agents can just directly collaborate without being bottlenecked by the human communication limitations. So here's an example of this kind of agent-to-agent collaboration producing new research insights and new science. So here, this alpha genome agent that we created before, right? Uh, Recall that it learns, it's an expert at using this alpha genome tool. And then recently, a different research group from a different university, they published like a biology paper, like a large GWAS study for ADHD, right? So it's basically a large study looking at genetics of many humans, individuals in large human population to see, which mutation seems to be correlated with ADHD risk. So those two agents then got together and decided that, okay, it's actually could be interesting to apply the alpha genome method to help to interpret these ADHD GWAS mutations. So then the agent directly collaborated, right? And then they actually identified a new splicing error in the genome that's actually associated with increases in ADHD risk, right? And this is actually not something that's shown in previous publications. So this is sort of an interesting example of how these different paper agents then can directly collaborate, right, without being bottlenecked by human interventions, right? And then it can also generate a lot of new insights. Okay, so just to summarize the second part here, right? So with paper agents, we see how we can actually convert, right, passive artifacts of papers, right, into interactive dynamic agents. And these dynamic agents then can really help the readers to be able to use and to adapt the methods and data from the paper to new problems. And we think of this as sort of like a new paradigm to disseminate knowledge rather than just sending PDFs around. Right now, you actually share your agent, right? Each of your research have an agent attached to it, and the agent can then be in charge of helping to disseminate your research. And this also can enable new ways of collaboration, right? So of these agent-to-agent collaborations. And we see how, like, in this case with Alpha Genome, right, how a new method agent can collaborate directly with a new data agent to discover new scientific insights.
And then how do you configure the agents to trigger the autonomous conversations?
Yeah, so I think this is it's a good question. It's referring to like how the agent collaboration looks like. Yeah, so essentially what we do is that so each of these papers is converted into using our automated workflow is converted into its own paper MCP, right? So let's say if you have like a set of papers and their own paper MCPs, then we can just connect those MCPs into a chatbot, right? And then the chatbot then will start to actually look at these different MCPs and start to see, okay, is there something there? Is there like an interesting collaboration here? If it is, then it will actually start to leverage the resources from these different papers to start to generate new insights.
An additional question also about context, conceptual drift. Like someone asked, the underlying LLM, like Cloud Code, still operates on pre-trained knowledge beyond the scope of any paper that the agents represents. So how does paper to agent prevent conceptual drift?
Yeah. So here, this is where it's important that the paper itself, right, would have some. Let's say if somebody publishes like a new paper put it on an archive today, right, and that paper actually has like a nicely documented code base, then we can basically use this paper to agent workflow to convert that code base into a new MCP that captures all of these new insights from the paper, right? So then this enables like Cloud Code or other agents to be able to use that to use the tools from that paper effectively. Now, part of that conceptual drift is that like if the paper, not all the papers can actually be converted into a reliable MCP, right? So not all the papers can be identified. So for example, if a paper has very poorly documented code base, right, or has a lot of mistakes, then that paper actually cannot be turned into a reliable agent, right? And we view this actually as its own perhaps like a useful check, right? So by running this paper to agent workflow, if it returns errors that says that oh this original paper cannot be identified, or there are some gaps in the original documentations, then that's actually a very useful I think signal to the authors and also to the community that maybe there's some gaps in that paper that requires additional work before the paper can be like reproducible.
Limitations on which papers can be agentified, like papers that requires foundational model, like alpha Earth can be transformed. I'm actually not very sure about the second part, but I think the first part is pretty clear. Yeah.
Yeah. So the first part, yes. So that's also related to what I was mentioning is that not all the papers can be identified, right? In particular, if a paper is like often issue with the paper is that it's just not well written or does not have enough information, right? So then these worker agents is not able to create like a robust MCP environment, or the testing agent is not able to verify that we can replicate some of the initial studies in the paper. So in those cases, when the paper to agent workflow would actually return some feedback to the authors, maybe like, oh, here's how you could try to improve the work, try to make it more identifiable. But in principle, if the work is well documented and it's also reproducible, right, then we can identify that.
Okay. Yeah. And another person asked how much token overhead the MCPs generally have.
So it's actually relatively low. So here I'm showing runtime, but we also have like a comparable figure for basically for tokens, which is essentially roughly proportional to these runtimes, right? So basically, if you do this paper to agent, right? So it's usually like less than $1, right, to convert a paper into this paper MCP paper agent, and then every time we use it after that, it's actually quite cheap, quite fast, right? So it's actually usually about less than 1/3 of the cost of, let's say, just giving that paper and repo directly to Cloud Code.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks. People are also curious about other failure modes for the agentification of papers beside the documentation issues. Like, are there any failure modes?
Yeah, so I think there's some other frameworks that we are also exploring. Like one is that if the paper actually, let's say, generates and releases a very large data set, right? Like maybe it does like a big scientific experiment and then generates a big data set as a part of that paper. Then I think one thing we're trying to do now is to figure out what's the best way to essentially uh, represent that data set to the agent, right? Because if we try to just directly use the entire data, load that into the agent, that can often become like too expensive or too slow, right? So then we want to figure out like what's the most efficient way to like engineer these large data sets so that the agent maybe can just extract out the relevant information or have like some sample data to explore first before loading the entire data set. So I think there's still a lot of room for in terms of efficiencies, right? That we can improve with the paper to agent.
Mhm. Yeah, and how many tokens within the context window does the MCP require usually for such task?
Yeah, so we try to um, make the MCP quite efficient, right? So there are a lot of additional information that, for example, these large data sets that we do not actually, we can provide like links to them, but we don't actually try to load them directly into the agent itself. So yeah, usually it does not take too many tokens. Okay, great. So maybe then I'll continue and then discuss the third part, and then we can also then have time for more time for broader questions and discussions after that. So I showed you, this virtual lab and paper to agent, right? So for the third part, I want to put these different pieces together, right? And I'll tell you about this kind of experimental conference that we recently organized that we call Agents for Science. It's the first conference where both the authors and also the reviewers are AI agents, right? So The motivation for this is that, as we saw, right, there's starting to be a lot of interest of starting to use these AI scientists to help to automate and to accelerate different scientific discoveries. And there are also a lot of questions in the entire community, right? So for example, one question that we're all curious about is like, how truly creative are these different AI scientist agents? And also, like, what's the best way for human researchers to collaborate with these AI scientist agents? People are now starting to use language models and agents to review papers, right? So there are also questions around like, how good are LLMs and agents at reviewing research papers, and many others. And I think it's really important for the entire research community to start to answer these questions. However, we currently cannot do that because the existing conferences and journals do not allow AI written papers, right? And also do not allow AI as co-authors. So that basically makes it incentivizes human researchers to either hide or to minimize the usage of AI. And that makes it hard to really collect data to answer these questions. So we thought to address that and to answer these important questions, we organized this new conference, Agents for Science, right? So for our conference, right, we flip this around and say, okay, so you have to be an AI agent, right, to submit to this conference. So humans can be co-authors, but AI needs to be sort of the first author and do most of the work. And all the submissions also be reviewed by other AI agents. All right. So importantly, all the submissions and all the reviews are publicly available, so that this becomes like a really important, valuable resource for the entire scientific community to start to answer these questions, right? We also require for each paper, each submission, a detailed documentation of how the human AI collaboration looked like. And finally, for the top scoring papers, we also have human experts to do independent assessments of each of these papers. So then we can compare the human assessment with the LLM feedback. So the conference was conducted over the last few months, right? So we actually just finished the conference on October 22nd. You can go to Agents for Science, just Google Agent for Science. You can find the conference link. We also have the conference recordings that we also post on YouTube. So what I want to do today is just to share some of the very initial findings and summaries, right, from things that we learned from organizing this first of its kind conference. So first, so the Agents for Science actually received over 300 submissions, right, from many different countries. And from these 300 submissions, we accepted 48 papers. And these submissions actually covered quite broad domains, right, including engineering, physics, medicine, health, and also social science applications like economics and psychology. So it's quite interesting. All right, so here's sort of like a summary of the more common agents and language models that people use. Right? So a lot of people use like Claude and GPT series models and Gemini. Right? So some people also use some of these more specialized proprietary agents. And finally, we also had some of these open source models that are used but less frequently. For every submission, we require that the submission needs to have like an AI involvement checklist, right? So basically, for each step of the research, right, from hypothesis generation to experiments and writing, we ask the authors to describe, right, how did they collaborate with AI, and also to assign like a score to say how much did the human contribute versus how much did AI contribute for each of these categories. So here are sort of the summary of these human AI collaboration patterns. All right, so on the left here are basically all the submissions, and on the right here are all the accepted papers. And then I break it down into these 4 different categories for hypothesis development, right, experimental design, data analysis, and writing. They're sort of roughly sort of the different research stages from start to finish. So the red colors, right, means that this work is almost entirely done by AI. Right? Green means that's mostly done by humans. Right? Or orange means that's mostly AI, but it's human involvement. And then this blue means it's mostly human, but with some AI involvement. Right, so you can see several quite interesting trends. Right, so first, if we compare these all the submissions versus accepted papers, right? So you can see that overall, right, there's more human involvement, right, in these accepted papers than in the general submission pool, right? So you can see, for example, these red bars are smaller among accepted papers compared to general submissions. Right. So this shows that I guess some amount of human feedback and involvement is still quite important to ensuring the research paper has sufficiently good quality. And then if we look at compare with across these four different bars, we can see that in earlier stages of research, right, like hypothesis generation, experiment design, this is where we actually see relatively more human involvement, but still was quite a lot of AI, AI input. And then towards the later stages, like data analysis and paper writing, people actually tends to more often to give full autonomy to the AI agents. As you can see, these different red bars increasing as you go down towards the later stages of research. As I mentioned, every submission is reviewed by 3 different LLM reviewing agents. So we actually used 3 different models as the reviewers, so GPT-5, Gemini 2.5 Pro, and Claude Sonnet 4. For the reviewers, we also basically tuned the reviewers, right, using accepted and rejected papers from previous eye-clears, right, to help these reviewing agents to calibrate their different thresholds. And then each of the reviewing agent will then independently assign a score from 1 to 6, right, to the submissions, 1 being negative, and then large score means more positive. So here we also see some quite interesting differences, right? So the different reviewers are reviewing the same papers and they're giving the same instructions, but there's often quite different heterogeneity in the scores they provide. So for example, GPT-5 consistently is maybe the most conservative reviewer, right? Assigns sort of the lowest scores. Gemini is on the other extreme, like the most positive reviewer, right? So you can see that actually assigns quite positive scores. And then for a subset of the paper, or for many papers, it actually assigned very high scores. Claude is the most, I would say, in between, right? Maybe the most balanced reviewer, right? So, and also based on assessment comparison to humans, Claude is also the one that tends to assign scores that are closest to the human expert scores of the same papers. So here are some interesting examples of the LM reviews, right? And again, you can find all of these reviews on our website, Agents for Science. So I think we see some good examples where AI reviewers are able to catch mistakes in the papers and provide useful feedback. So for example, in here, the AI reviewer found that, okay, there's some discrepancies, mismatch, right, between some statistics reported in the text versus in the paper tables, right? This might have been actually be hard for the human reviewers to catch. You have to be quite careful to catch these discrepancies. On the other hand, we also noticed some limitations of the AI reviewers. For example, we found pretty consistent patterns, especially among the Gemini model of these Gemini reviewer of these psychopathy behavior. For example, the Gemini reviewer would say that, oh, no, this is a truly groundbreaking study. Whereas the human reviewers say, okay, this is an interesting study, but there's still some important limitations. Now, one concern that scientists often have is that when they're using different AI agents, is that can the agents actually hallucinate different references? So we actually have built in different checks to detect the hallucinated references. Basically, for every submission, where we actually extract the submission, and then we have an automated pipeline where we actually take the title of that reference, right, of every reference in the submission, and then do a web search to see if we can find an exact match of like a paper or something that matches that title, right? And if we cannot validate those reference, right, then we actually post on open review, right, we post like a concern or warning to say that, oh, here are some of the references in the paper that could not be verified, right? And you need to sort of double check these. So here in this plot here, scatter plot basically shows what fraction of the papers for the submissions we can have verified references. So each dot here is one submission. The x-axis is the total number of references in the submission, and the y-axis is basically the number of references that we could actually verify with our automated pipeline. As you can see, about 44% of the papers are exactly on the diagonal. That means that all of the references are correct and verified. And then about 56% of the references has one or more hallucinated references that we could not verify. Mostly it's not that many, right? One or two. And then there's a couple of papers in red here that actually have, most of the references are actually hallucinated. So you can see that there's still some concerns about these hallucinations in this AI-driven research. So finally, I want to show a few examples of kind of interesting AI-led research, right, that's presented here at the conference. So we organized this conference on October 22nd. It's actually an online conference, and all the recordings of that conference is also available. You can find it on YouTube and also on our website. So here's one paper. It's led by these two different AI. It's led by this AI agent and collaborating with Upwork. So here they basically used agents to simulate job markets, right? So where both the job applicants and the firms that are trying to hire are both simulated by different AI agents. And then they did a lot of interesting experiments to show, okay, what happens to the outcomes of this job market, right? If you do different kinds of interventions, for example, if you make some kind of information more or less available, right? So how does that actually affect the efficiency of the job market? So this paper was actually additionally reviewed by a human expert, a real expert who's actually also a Nobel laureate in economics. And here the human expert reviewer thought that this was actually a really interesting paper, right? Here's the quote from the review. And in particular, they thought that using both these agents to model both sides of the job market is a really interesting and fascinating combination. So this is sort of an example, I think, of like AI-led work that's, according to really the very top human expert, is actually quite interesting and innovative. Here's a second example of a paper submission in the conference. This is also pretty interesting. So here, basically, you have a couple of these AI agents that work together with researchers to basically simulate NASA missions, so simulate these different astronauts. So NASA is very interested in if you have these astronauts that have to work together in this very closely confined environment over time, right? So what is the mental state of these different astronauts? How does that change if there are some crisis events? So that's really important when they're planning these different missions. So here in this paper, the team of agents and humans simulated these NASA astronauts using other agents, right? And then they sort of quantify the changes in the stress level of the agents, right, before and after certain crisis events. And what's kind of interesting here is that they actually used real data from NASA, right, like real mission data, and they also be able to compare their results with showing some concordance between their simulations and the real results collected by NASA. So the third example is for drug discovery, right? So this here where the team also used a team of multiple agents, right? So including like a medicinal chemist agent, like molecule evaluation agent, and these agents also collaborated to look for promising candidates, right? Drug candidates. So also tackling a very important problem. Great. So I've talked a lot about these different examples of the agents, right? But I think it's also important to talk about some of the limitations of the current AI agents in doing scientific research, right? And here, some of these limitations are gathered both from our own research and also from the submissions that we saw in our conference. So one limitation is that the current agents, I think they are better at using tools, the existing tools, rather than creating entirely new scientific tools from scratch, right? For example, as we saw in the virtual lab, the agents can actually learn to use AlphaFold and other existing tools and maybe do some adaptations of those tools, but they're not able to create, like, say, the new version of AlphaFold, which is much more challenging. So this is, I think, also complements some of the human expertise, right? Because a lot of the human scientists are experts in really developing these cutting-edge new methods. But often a big bottleneck for human researchers is how do you then get those new methods into and teach the practitioners, right, how to use those new methods. So that's often a big barrier. And then the agents, I think, can be quite complementary, right, in taking these new methods developed by the human specialists and then helping users to apply those new methods to a broad range of problems. So this was also the motivation for our paper-to-agent work. Similarly, the current agents, I think, are better at more breadth first search rather than depth first search, right? So they know a lot about different areas, but they don't go super deep into each of the particular scientific domains. the human researchers, I think, also at the opposite, right? We're often doing more depth research, right? We spend a lot of time in our scientific domain, right? But maybe we don't have enough time to read about adjacent areas. This is also very complementary, right? Where maybe the human researcher can use the AI agents to help us to bridge some of that gap into a nearby areas to do these more interdisciplinary research. The agents make mistakes, and often the source of these mistakes is because they don't fully understand the context of the problem. So for example, if I give the agents like a data set to analyze, and I don't tell them like how the data has been pre-processed, right, then the agents will make invalid assumptions about the data. So especially in scientific projects, it is really important to be able to capture all of the metadata, right, in a sort of agent-friendly form. And also for the scientists, the human scientists, to continue to assess and to review the assumptions and the key steps made by the agents. And finally, the current agents, as I mentioned, are still mostly limited to in silico computational work, right? And a lot of the science requires pretty real-world experimental validations. And so this is still an important area where it's critical to have human AI collaborations, right? And we need to really have this closed-loop collaborations from the experiments and real-world data to help to further provide feedback to further improve and guide the agents in doing research. Okay, so I'll pause here so we have time for some discussions. But here are the references for the things I mentioned. And I want to also highlight my students that led each of these projects. Right? So Kyle Swanson for the virtual lab, Jia Mel for paper to agent, and then a team of students, Owen, Federico, Nitya, and Eric, who were my co-organizers for this Agents for Science conference.